morning, everyone. Welcome to this Ridouts Masterclass. My name is Caroline Barker. I'm a director at Ridouts. And today I am going to be talking to you around how the CQC can restrict your business using the method of a notice of proposal and notice of decision. And they can do a variety, they can take a variety of action by cancelling your registration, putting conditions on your registration. So hopefully you'll find today useful. We are recording this session and we will be putting up the recording on Ridouts' website and YouTube channel, and we will be sending out the actual slides to all participants later on today. So you will get a copy. I'll be taking questions at the end of today's session. So if you could pop any questions that you have in the Q&A function of the Zoom facility, that would be fantastic, and I will try and get through as many of those as possible when we've finished the masterclass. So you may be wondering, why does any CQC restricting your business, why does it matter to you, particularly if you've currently got a good or outstanding rating? Well, during COVID, the CQC seemingly went AWOL. Physical inspections decreased, that was for certain, and enforcement action generally was down. But at Ridouts, we've been seeing that CQC have increased its activity, particularly since autumn 2021, and has definitely been an increase in enforcement action. Now, in the current environment, as you will be aware, CQC have moved away from the timetabled inspections. So you are no longer waiting for an inspection after 6 months, 12 months, 2 years, whatever the timescale was according to your rating. And they've moved to this risk model. So they are coming in to providers where they perceive there is risk. So this can be a trigger for inspection and enforcement action. Now, I've got some information here that I got together it was actually December at the end of last year. Now, CQC actually conducted 962 inspections in November, which was the highest number of inspections that had actually undertaken since June last year. And of those inspections that have a recorded risk trigger, so not your regulatory history where you've got your poor inspection reports or anything that requires them to come in more frequently, 48% of those inspections were actually triggered by information of concern. Now, information of concern for CQC relates to whistleblowing or complaints. So it only needs one whistleblower or one complaint to potentially put you on the radar of CQC. And over the 12 months up to December last year, 27% of the inspections that CQC carried out led to civil enforcement action. And CQC can also take criminal enforcement action. So it's not a small proportion of inspections that actually resulted in enforcement being taken by CQC. Now, you will have seen from the advert for this particular masterclass that CQC has the power to cancel your registration, suspend it, and place restrictions on your registration. And this can severely impact how you run your business. It may be reducing the number of service users that you can admit, or it can result in you having to close your location altogether. So no one is exempt from coming under the scrutiny of CQC. And I think this is even more relevant given CQC's new regulatory model, which, okay, it has been delayed and they'll be implementing it at the end of this year, 2024. But what they are actually wanting to do is to move towards more contemporary ratings. So we are going to have to wait and find out how this is going to happen in practice. But what you might find is that your ratings change more frequently. So you may find that rather than, as I said, having 6 months, 12 months, 2 years of one particular rating, you may find that you fluctuate more over the course of a year. So as I mentioned, notices of proposals and notice of decisions, that's what I'm going to be discussing today. And I thought it would be helpful just to actually set out what these are, because sometimes I think these terms are bandied around, particularly by lawyers, and as a provider, particularly when you've not experienced this type of action, it's helpful to actually think about what these are. So a notice of proposal is a document that the CQC has to issue to a provider if it proposes to take certain action, and we're going to be looking at those types of action shortly. And a notice of decision is a document that either the CQC has to issue after it has first issued a notice of proposal, or it actually can be the first document that the CQC serves when it takes urgent action against a provider. Now, I'm going to be talking today in relation to notices of proposals and decisions in respect of providers, but CQC can also issue notice of proposals and decisions in relation to registered managers. I think it's just important to note that nothing within this presentation is legal advice, but really it's so, the purpose of this is to understand the process, so that if you should ever be on the end of this type of force, you know what to expect, and you know that timescales are shorter, what you need to do should you be party to this action. Sometimes you'll see that I've shortened notice of proposal to a NOP, notice of decision to nod. That's just lawyers using jargon, but sometimes I'll refer to that. So just in case you're wondering what those terms refer to. So early on a Tuesday morning, I'm going to get you to engage your brains. I'm going to ask you to pop in answers to this particular poll, just to get a view of your, your working knowledge of notice of proposals and decisions. So what action can the CQC not take against you by issuing a notice of proposal or decision? Is it prevent a home from carrying on, so cancel its registration, prevent you from admitting service users, cancel your provider registration with immediate effect, or require you to send them weekly audit reports, or stop you providing nursing care, assuming that you are registered for nursing care? So I'll just give you a couple of moments to pop in your answers. Don't worry, I can't see how anyone's voting, so no one else can either. So you're not going to be marked depending on what you pop in. Okay, James, would you like to end the poll? Okay, so what you can see is, yes, most of you have answered correctly. They cannot cancel your provider registration with immediate effect. Now, it can be done via a different method, via a magistrate's court order, which I will discuss later on. And I suppose technically, if you are a one-home provider, they could remove your location under Section 31 with immediate effect, therefore almost essentially rendering your overarching provider registration obsolete. But you're absolutely right, they can't cancel your provider registration with immediate effect using the NOP or NOD process. But the remainder that are on here, they can do via that process. So it shows you the wide range of action that they can take. Thank you, James, if you could just remove that. Thank you. So yeah, cancel your provider registration. So yeah, looking at how they can actually CQC restrict your business. They can cancel, they can suspend your registration, they can vary registration, they can remove conditions. So remember, your locations are conditions on your registration. So if they remove a location, you can no longer carry on regulated activities there. They can impose conditions. So an example that you saw on the poll was requesting that you send audits to the CQC on a weekly basis. That's an example. Or a negative condition, for example, you're not permitted to admit service users without the CQC's consent. They could also vary your conditions, for example, by stopping you providing nursing care, as I mentioned, on the assumption that you are registered for nursing care, or they could reduce the number of service users you can provide regulated activities to. They can also restrict business before it's even got off the ground through refusing you registration. I'm not going to concentrate on that today. I'm looking at when you've already been established as a provider, but if you were to apply for to carry on a regulated activity, CQC could refuse that, and they'd have to go through this process of issuing a notice of proposal and notice of decision. I thought it was would be helpful just to set out this particular slide around how providers are set up, because sometimes it can indicate what type of action CQC will take when it's looking at enforcement action against a provider. Now, if you are a single location provider, so you have one location registered to you, if CQC want to take urgent action in order to shut down your home, then they are more likely to go to a magistrate's court. But if you're a multiple location provider with several locations, then we find that they tend to use the option of the urgent action under Section 31. Again, I'm going to be talking about these in due course, but I think it's good to understand how you're set up as a provider, because, as I say, it can give an indication as to how CQC how CQC will take action against you should it think it needs to. So, yes, I've mentioned there are different types of action that the CQC can take. There are notice of proposals, notice of decisions on a slow and urgent basis, and there are also, they could go to a magistrate's court. And you follow a process which ultimately all three will go to an independent tribunal called the first tier tribunal. So I thought it would be helpful to show you each of these processes so you get an understanding of how they work in practice. So a notice of proposal, which we term the slow process. Now, that's not its official name, that's how we refer to it within Ridouts. And the reason for that being it can take a relatively long period of time for it to come to fruition, should it go all the way through to an appeal process, compared to that of urgent proceedings. Notice of proposal is served under Section 26 of the Health and Social Care Act 2008. CQC can cancel registration, suspend, vary, remove, impose all the things that we've already mentioned against you by issuing a notice of proposal. Now, on this slide, I thought it would be helpful again to set out what a notice of proposal looks like. Now, on the left-hand side of this particular slide, it's the first page of a notice of proposal. And you can see that it's been served by email. It says it's a notice of proposal to cancel. It refers to Section 17 of the Health and Social Care Act, and that is the cancellation provision. And then it says your registration history, the proposal to cancel, and then it moves on to the evidence relied upon. Now, on the right-hand side of the slide, this relates to imposing conditions on registration, and it says it relates to, refers to Section 12 of the Health and Social Care Act, and that is the variation section of the Act. Now, the reason of pulling up these particular examples is that you can see it refers to different sections of the Act. In the second example on the right-hand side of the slide, it says this notice is served under Section 26. Now, CQC are not necessarily consistent in how they present this information, but it should always say that it's a notice of proposal. But if in doubt, seek advice and show them this document so you can determine the action that's being taken. So as I've mentioned, the notice of proposal will start off with your registration history, and it will provide the reasons why CQC is proposing to take the action that it is. And the most common reason that we see is because the regulated activity or activities that you're registered for is being or has at any time being carried on otherwise in accordance with the relevant regulations, so relevant requirements. And the relevant requirements, the main ones that CQC tend to rely on, are the Care Quality Commission Registration Regulations 2009 and the Health and Social Care Act 2008 Regulated Activities Regulations 2014. And these will be referred to throughout the notice of proposal. The NOP will also look at the evidence that's being relied upon, it will provide a conclusion, and they have to say that you have the right to make representations. And it will also refer to appendices. So if we just go back to the previous slide, you can see about 2/3 of the way down on the left-hand side, Appendix 1, Certificate of Registration. Now, CQC don't tend to provide bundles of documents. They used to, they don't anymore, because these documents are documents that are within your own possession as a provider. But what we find often, what they do is they anonymise service users' names. So they'll refer to them as service user A, B, C, etc. throughout the notice of proposal. What they should be doing is sending you a key so you are aware of which service users they're referring to. And if they don't do that, then you should be asking them immediately for that key, because the timescales in which you have to respond to this notice of proposal are very short, and you don't need to be trying to second guess who they're referring to. You need to understand the allegations that are being made against you. So important to note that a notice of proposal, clues in the name, it is a proposal only. At this stage, the action doesn't take effect. They're only proposing that they take this action. And you do have the right to make representations, which we'll talk about. But if you don't make representations, then the CQC will go on to issue a notice of decision, which you then have the right to appeal. So there's a few stages to this particular type of action. I'm going to run another poll to test again your knowledge of this. So how long do you have to make representations to a notice of proposal issued by the CQC? Is it 10 working days, 10 calendar days, 28 working days, or 28 calendar days? So just pop in your thoughts on that, and we'll look at the answers shortly. Okay, would you mind sharing the poll, please? Okay, so the majority of you believe it's 10 working days. Unfortunately, that's not correct, or maybe fortunately, because that's a very short period of time. So I think you've probably fallen into the trap of 10 working days being the length of time to make factual accuracy comments to an inspection report. The answer is actually that you have 28 calendar days in which to do so. So well done to those people who have said that. Be aware though, there are specific statutory rules around when a notice of proposal is served on you. If you're unsure, take advice, because that dictates when the period of 28 calendar days starts from. Also be aware that if you've given an email address to CQC, they may well be using that to serve documentation on you. They used to send them by post. I've seen them physically deliver them to providers, but they tend to come by email now. So make sure that you're monitoring email addresses. Make sure they're being monitored if people go away, and be careful, because 28 calendar days, obviously longer than 10 working days, is still not a very long time in which to make representations, because notice of proposals can extend to tens of pages of documents with hundreds of pages of appendices. So it does take a lot of time to go through. these documentation and build your response to the proposal. So it is a statutory deadline. These are, the 28 days comes from legislation, from the Health and Social Care Act, so it can't be moved. So in comparison to your factor-exit comments of 10 working days, which is essentially a CQC guidance point, these are statutory deadlines. So if you miss it, not ideal, but you go on to the next stage of notice of decision being issued, but obviously best to deal with it at the notice of proposal stage. So don't sit on it, don't ignore it, and try and take action as soon as you receive it. I say this because having a notice of proposal issued on you or served on you can have a huge knock-on effect. CQC cannot publish to the wider world that they are taking this action against you. It's prevented by the legislation. But they can share with commissioners that they have concerns. And unfortunately, this can lead to other issues. So we have seen local authorities coming in to locations to assess service users with a view to moving them and telling them that the home is closing. And at this stage, it's a proposal, and it takes several months sometimes if you go through to the full end of appeal process before any action takes effect. It can therefore be unsettling for staff and service users, and you've got to think carefully about how and when this is communicated to people, if at all. And a notice of proposal, doesn't often come out of the blue, often follows a poor inspection report. So you may find that you have a draft inspection report to respond to. So you've got factor-exit comments. They may have issued a warning notice against you. And if you've had an inspection report and it's resulted in publication of the report, then that can also prompt local media interest. So you're asking to respond to journalists about this. And of course, family members are going to be concerned and want to know what's happening with their loved ones. So within this 28-day calendar period, you may have a number of different documents to respond to and a lot of stakeholder interest that you're having to deal with. So it's really not a long period of time. It is important to go through a notice proposal with a fine-tooth comb, understand and address each allegation. The CQC are supposed to consider the current position. So when you're making representations, you can set out what improvements you've made, and you must be setting it out with evidence. The burden of proof is on CQC to demonstrate that you are not complying with the regulations, but the reality is that you are going to have to demonstrate that you are complying with them. And I think it's really important that this is discussed with your legal representatives, because each notice of proposal is different. How you approach it from a statutory perspective can differ according to the facts. So, what we would be looking at is relating everything back to the legislation, because that is what you're being judged against. Keeping you on your toes with a third poll, during the representation and appeal process, how many times does the CQC have to re-inspect your home? First option, none, don't have to come in at all, once, twice, or once a month whilst the proceedings are ongoing. Just pop your response in. Okay, James, if you'd like to share the results. Oh, well done, everybody. Yeah, absolutely. The CQC don't have to come in at all. Now, you'd think that they would come in to check the current position, and they do often, but they don't have to. And I think this is actually, but what we're finding is that CQC are tending not to come in as much as they used to do at the notice of proposal stage, and actually only then coming in during the appeal process stage, which, given the fact that they are supposed to consider the current position, if you are putting forward your representations and saying things have changed, you'd think that they'd want to come back and actually check out what you're saying is correct. But CQC could come in every day if they wanted to, as you know. They have the powers to come and inspect at any time, but they're not legally obliged to. So if you submit representations, and we would normally recommend that you do, then CQC will consider those representations. They are currently saying they will take around 60 working days to respond to those representations, but we've seen that it can be shorter or indeed longer. And once they've considered the representations, they will then issue a notice of decision. And this will either be to adopt the proposal, so they think that the action is still warranted, and they will continue with the action that they're proposing, or they will not adopt the proposal, so they accept what you've said, and essentially that's the end of the proceedings. If they don't adopt the proposal, then all things go back to normal, and you carry on. If, however, they do adopt the proposal, then again, it's not the end of proceedings. You have a further 28 calendar days to appeal to what I've referred to as the first tier care standards tribunal. And this is the first time that the process goes to an external body. So they're independent of CQC, and ultimately this will be decided by this tribunal. Again, beware of the service of the notice of decision, because that dictates when your 28 calendar days runs from. And again, this is a statutory deadline. So if you do not appeal, then the proposed action will take effect. So if you don't do it after 28 calendar days, then whatever action had been proposed will now come into effect. So really important that you're aware of your timescales. When you do get to a tribunal, should you get to this position, then you have to lodge an appeal. There are forms to fill in. You have to provide reasons, you have to give evidence, and you have to state what your desired outcome is. And usually you don't want the action to take effect. CQC then have 20 working days to respond to your appeal. Now, we have had a number of successes at this stage where CQC say they're not going to adopt the proposal because robust representations have been put in with significant evidence to the proposal. But, often, frequently, they do oppose the appeal. And then you move into the more procedural aspects of court proceedings. Shortly after this, there will be what is known as a telephone case management hearing, or a TCMH, and this will be with the judge that ultimately is going to hear the appeal along with legal representatives, and he'll lay down directions. So he will set out a timetable of when parties have to comply with doing certain things, and that will include exchanging evidence, supplementary evidence, working out who your witnesses are going to be, and the date of an ultimate hearing. There's also something that sometimes is ordered is called a Scott schedule. Now, the purpose of a Scott schedule is to try and limit or narrow the issues in contention. So they will say, the judge will say, okay, CQC, so what points are you seeking to rely on as part of this action? But what we are finding is the CQC will just simply regurgitate everything that they put in the notice of proposal and not say, well, actually, we accept the points that were raised in the representations that were submitted by the provider. So it is, it should be quite useful, but we find that sometimes it can be quite voluminous and actually doesn't help narrow the issues as much as we would like. But it is something to be aware of, that the judge can order direct to be done. Now, if you do get to the first tier tribunal and you get to a full hearing, it will be heard by a and 2 specialist lay panel members. And they are entitled to ask questions of the witnesses. So your witnesses will have to come along, those who have submitted witness statements, and they will have to swear an oath or an affirmation. And then they will be questioned by the CQC, or rather their legal representation. I've never seen them not have a legal representative represent them at a tribunal. And you, or again, normally legal representation, can also ask questions of the witnesses. Now, the judge and the panel members will consider the evidence, they'll weigh it up, essentially decide whose evidence they prefer, and they'll make a decision to either allow the appeal, in which case you win, and that's the end of the matters, or they will dismiss the appeal, in which case you lose, and the action proposed takes effect. The tribunal can also impose its own conditions if they see fit to do so. That's also something to bear in mind during the course of the proposal stage and before you get to a tribunal, of whether there are negotiations to be had around whether conditions could potentially be proposed. But again, discuss it with your legal representative. It's not always conducive or warranted in every single case. So I've already mentioned CQC are supposed to consider the current position at the time they take the decision. The first tier tribunal is supposed to do that as well. It is supposed to look at what is the position at the location at the time it is, essentially considering your appeal. Are you currently complying? Now, that isn't to say that your history isn't irrelevant. You will find that CQC in the notice of proposal will put every single interaction you've ever had with them in the notice of proposal to demonstrate essentially that you are not a fit provider to be carrying on regulated activities. So any reports, the rating, the fact that you've been in breach of a regulation, the fact that you've had a warning notice, that will form part of CQC's case. Essentially, they're looking at whether you are a provider that goes in and out of compliance. Are you just scraping by? As I say, it is different to a factual accuracy comments process. Improvements since the inspection can be considered. So very different compared to factual accuracy process. But I think also, just as a slight aside, because CQC do look at your history, if you do receive a draft inspection report or a warning notice that you do not agree with, it's really important to challenge that at the time that you receive those documents, because, as I say, they'll put all this into a notice of proposal, and it's not fatal, but it is harder for you to challenge at a later date, to say, well, actually, I didn't agree with it at the time, but I didn't do anything about it. So current position is important, but history is certainly not irrelevant. Now, I mentioned that this was, we refer to it as the slow process, and that is because from the time that a notice of proposal is issued to a full appeals hearing, should it get to that stage, it can take around 6 to 9 months. Can be shorter, can be longer, but on average, we find it's around this time. So yes, you've got some time to look at, to do something about this, but it's not a time to sit back and think, oh, I've got 9 months to deal with this. You don't. You need to be making improvements, and you need to be embedding them, because when you get to that tribunal, or at any point throughout the period, you need to be saying, we are compliant, we are a fit provider, we can demonstrate with evidence that we are doing everything that we ought to do. Now, CQC can withdraw its opposition to the appeal. It may propose to dispose of the proceedings by way of conditions, as I've already mentioned. There are opportunities along the way to negotiate with CQC, but that also involves demonstrating that you have made changes where appropriate, and often, improvements can be made. And I think it's important that you are demonstrating those to CQC. If we are able to negotiate, then the parties have to draw up what is called a consent order and present that to the tribunal, assuming we've got to the appeal stage, because the judge has to approve the consent order. That is the notice of proposal stage. I'm going to just quickly go through section 31, which is the urgent procedure, and also the magistrate's court order, because I think it's important to for providers to understand the different types of action that can be taken in the timescales. So an urgent notice of decision is served under section 31 of the Health and Social Care Act. The notice of proposal stage is bypassed, so you don't have the right to make representations. You will straight away go to an appeal to the first tier tribunal. Now, the CQC can issue an urgent notice of decision if it has reasonable cause to believe that unless it acts, any person will or may be exposed to the risk of harm. Quite a low bar. They can vary, remove, impose conditions, suspend, extend periods of suspension of your registration. Now, I haven't mentioned cancellation there, but remember, locations are conditions on your registration. So by removing a condition, they can essentially cancel a home's registration by serving you with a piece of paper. You still have 28 days, calendar days, from the time the notice of decision is given to appeal to the first tier tribunal. And the first tier tribunal and CQC actually have what is known as a memorandum of understanding. They recognise the restrictions to being placed on a business by virtue of an urgent notice of decision. And actually, you will end up in a hearing in front of the tribunal within about 10 working days of an appeal being lodged. So it is a very much speeded up process compared to the notice of proposal. You will still have a telephone case management hearing. You will still have to decide witnesses and take witness statements and still gather evidence, but it is a much more truncated period of time. So again, a poll, fourth poll of the day. If the CQC serves a section 31 notice of decision on you, you must start to do what it says. A, after the 28 days, you have to lodge an appeal. B, after you lose an appeal. C, only if your managing director confirms that you should. Or D, immediately. Okay, James, if you wouldn't mind sharing the poll results. Well done, correct everybody. Yes, immediately. You have to comply immediately. It takes effect immediately. So if you've had a section 31 notice of decision to remove a location, you can no longer carry on a regulated activity there. Why should you be complying with it? Because it is a criminal offence to carry on a regulated activity without being registered, or to fail to comply with a condition of registration without reasonable excuse, and you can be prosecuted by the CQC. Also think about, there are lots of risks involved. There are insurance risks. If you do not have a CQC registration to carry on a regulated activity, there are going to be insurance concerns, and also things around staffing, who's paying for staffing, and potential liabilities that could arise. In relation to conditions, failure to comply with conditions, CQC, as I mentioned earlier, can impose positive or negative conditions, but conditions need to be clear because, as I say, it is a criminal offence to not comply with a condition of registration. So we would be saying that any conditions that are imposed need to be clear so you understand how you can meet the requirements of that condition. And I thought it would be helpful just to pull up a couple of examples. So an example of a positive condition, and this is a real example from a case from a few years ago. CQC wanted the provider to send a monthly report to them, analysing all incidents that have resulted in harm to service users at each registered location. Bear in mind, this was they had over 10 locations. In the preceding calendar month, and setting out the action taken or intended to be taken as a result of each incident. Provide a report on how incidents and notifiable events have been reported appropriately to the local authority, and CQC. Now, underneath are just a few bullet points around why we would be saying this is not clear. So there is no definition of harm. There is no definition of notifiable events, even though under the Care Quality Commission registration regulations, you have notifiable events under Regulation 18. That is not referred to within this particular condition. There is no definition of the local authority. Are you reporting to the host safeguarding local authority or all commissioning local authorities? And do you have to report every single event to both the local authority and the CQC, despite the potentially being variations in what is notified to each party? So we would be saying that this is not clear and precise. And there's also an element, I mentioned this was an actual example, the provider had over 10 locations. So this is also about being proportionate as well. Can you imagine having to do this for over 10 locations on a monthly basis? It's almost a full-time job. So there's lots of elements that we could be challenging in these circumstances if it is appropriate to do so. We also have an example of a negative condition. So you must not admit a service user without the written permission of the CQC. Very clear what you have to do or not do, not admit a service user. But we would be saying, well, what are the mechanisms for this? Who within CQC is going to consent to this? How long will they take to make a decision? We know full well that service users can't afford just to hang around for a few weeks while someone within CQC decides to get around to looking at an email that's come in, and what information is going to be required in order for CQC to give that permission. We would say that this could well be a backdoor closure because, of course, if you are not allowed to admit service users, over time you will have service users leaving your service and be left with no service users. So this is about about proportionality as well. Often CQC will say, as part of this type of negative condition, that their consent is not to be unreasonably withheld, whatever that means, but it still doesn't address the mechanisms around how this is dealt with within CQC. So it was a little bit of a whistle-stop tour of Section 31. So I'm conscious that we're getting to almost an hour, so I'm just going to quickly go over that of a magistrate's order. Magistrate's orders are not a notice of proposal or a notice of decision, but again, I think it's important for you to understand the types of action that can be taken by CQC. Now, in relation to Section 30 of the Health and Social Care Act 2008, this relates to the cancellation of a provider or manager in respect of a regulated activity. So it relates to cancellation only of your registration. And CQC can go to a magistrate's court and the magistrate can will make the order if it believes that unless the order is made, there will be a serious risk to a person's life, health, or well-being. As I mentioned earlier, it tends to be done for one-home providers, but again, when the order is made, it takes effect immediately. You have to comply or you face prosecution. And we've seen situations where service users are being blue lighted out of a home, and it's chaos. So you really don't want to find yourself in these circumstances if it can be helped. But I think it's important to understand timescales that are involved and what action can be taken. So you'll be pleased to hear one last poll, and then you don't have to use your brain anymore. How much notice must you be given as a provider of a magistrate's hearing? No notice, 24 hours, 10 working days, 28 calendar days. So just pop your answer into the poll and we'll have a look at the answers shortly. Okay, James, if you'd like to share the poll results. Ooh, pretty close. fairly evenly spread along no notice, 24 hours and 28 calendar days? The answer is that they don't have to give you any notice, actually. So they normally give you around 24 hours, but if the magistrate thinks that it's not appropriate to give notice, then they don't have to. So yeah, no notice has to be given. This type of action, however, it doesn't normally come out of the blue. CQC will be they will be highlighting that they have significant concerns. So they will essentially be coming in and saying, we are going to apply to a magistrate's court for an urgent cancellation. And then you normally find that it's listed for the following day, but technically no notice has to be given. Timescales that are involved are the same as, to appeal a magistrate's court order is the same process for a Section 31 urgent notice of decision. So again, you have 28 calendar days from the time that the order is made. You have to lodge an appeal at the first tier tribunal. You are heard within a very short space of time because, as I mentioned, they recognise that these are serious constraints on people's businesses. In this case, you've had your registration cancelled, your service users have moved out, and you still have to produce evidence and witnesses. And this is an additional hurdle to come over, to get over on a magistrate's court order, because usually your service users have been removed. So demonstrating compliance, not impossible, but harder when you don't have service users to show what you're doing. Again, I've mentioned this already, but first tier tribunal are supposed to consider the current position at the time it makes its decision. You will be at a hearing within about 6 weeks of the order, assuming that you take 28 days to respond to inspection, to respond to the to lodge your appeal. Again, this is a very short space of time. So particularly with the magistrate's order, they've said there are serious concerns. So there's a lot of work to be doing in a very short space of time in order for you to get up to speed to demonstrate that you are complying with the regulations. So, hopefully that will give you an overview of the types of things that are involved. Should you ever be party to a notice of proposal, notice of decision, or even indeed a magistrate's order. Timescales are short. As I've said, there's a lot can be happening within the timescales that you've got to respond to these documents. Ensure that you have resource available, dedicate resource, and don't ignore it. Sounds like a silly thing to do, but sometimes, people think, I don't know what to do about it. If you're not sure, seek legal advice, ask somebody to explain it to you. And as I mentioned, make sure you're monitoring email addresses, because things can get lost, things can get missed, and your timescales can reduce significantly if you're not on top of it. I think it's important to say that, these are, difficult proceedings to go through for anyone. But if you do have a notice of proposal, notice of decision, or even a magistrate's order issued, it's not the end of the road. It takes a lot of hard graft to get to a position where we can, be saying that things are okay and appeals should be allowed. But just because you've had this piece of paper does not mean that you cannot eventually run your business again. So hopefully that was helpful for everybody. I can see, so question being that the session will be available on Ridouts YouTube channel and website. We will be sharing the slides with you. So unless anyone else has got any questions, last opportunity. No? All right. Well, thank you very much. You've let me off the hook very easily. Thank you, everybody, for participating. Do appreciate it. I hope you found it useful, and have a good day, everyone. Thank you very much. Bye.